James Carter stepped into the dimly lit bar, the kind of place where locals gathered after a long week. At 47 years old, James was a man of few words. His broad shoulders and straight posture hinted at his years in the military, but his calm eyes and polite demeanor made him approachable. Dressed simply in a leather jacket and jeans, he looked like any other patron seeking a quiet evening. The bar was a mix of chatter, clinking glasses, and low music. James found a seat at the counter, nodding at the bartender, a middle-aged woman named Lisa who had worked there for years. "The usual?" she asked with a warm smile. James nodded. "Thanks, Lisa." As he sipped his drink, he couldn't help but notice the group in the corner. 5 young men, barely in their 20s, were talking loudly, their laughter cutting through the room. At first, it seemed harmless, just boys being boys. But as James listened, their words carried a tone that made the other patrons uncomfortable. They made exaggerated jokes, laughed at people walking past, and occasionally called out to Lisa in a way that bordered on rude. James observed quietly. It wasn't in his nature to jump into situations without understanding them first. He had seen worse in his life, far worse, and knew that patience often resolved more than anger. But tonight, there was something about the group's behavior that unsettled him. Lisa brought him another drink, her expression tight. "They've been like this for an hour," she muttered under her breath. "It's driving people away." James glanced around. A few patrons were leaving earlier than usual, shaking their heads. An older man in the corner, wearing a military cap, sat quietly, clearly trying to ignore the group's antics. James noticed the man flinch slightly when the group laughed particularly loudly, as if their noise carried something more than just volume. James sighed. He had come to the bar to relax, to enjoy a moment of peace after a week spent volunteering at the local community center. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble often had a way of finding him. One of the young men stood up, raising his glass to make a mock toast. "Here's to Friday nights and people who can't handle a little fun," he shouted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The group roared with laughter. Other patrons exchanged uneasy glances. James sipped his drink, his mind calculating. He didn't want to make a scene, but he also couldn't sit by and watch the group ruin the evening for everyone else. His years in the Marines had taught him many things: discipline, respect, and the importance of standing up when no one else would. He looked over at the older man with the military cap again. The man caught James's eye for a brief moment and gave him a weak, grateful smile. That was the tipping point. James straightened in his seat, his decision made. He'd wait for the right moment, but he wouldn't let this continue. Sometimes, doing the right thing meant stepping up, even when it wasn't easy. As he finished his drink, the group's laughter rang out again, louder this time. James set his glass down, his mind clear. Tonight, he wasn't just another patron at the bar. Tonight, he had a job to do. James sat quietly at the bar, his eyes fixed on his empty glass. The atmosphere around him was growing heavier by the minute. The group of young men in the corner continued their loud banter, their voices cutting through the soft murmur of the other patrons. What had started as annoying behavior now felt disrespectful and disruptive. Lisa, the bartender, moved briskly behind the counter, trying to stay professional despite the group's antics. She served them their drinks, ignoring their overly casual comments and exaggerated attempts to be charming. It was clear she wanted to keep the peace, but her tight-lipped smile revealed her frustration. James noticed the other patrons shifting in their seats, trying not to draw attention to themselves. The middle-aged couple near the entrance exchanged uneasy glances, and a few people whispered to each other, debating whether to leave. The once relaxing atmosphere of the bar had turned tense. Then, the group's laughter turned to mocking tones. They started making jokes about people in the room, their voices just loud enough for others to hear. One of them pointed toward the elderly man with the military cap in the corner. "What's with that guy? Is he auditioning for a war movie or something?" One of them sneered, drawing a chorus of laughter from the others. James felt a knot tighten in his chest. He glanced at the older man, who kept his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. The man's shoulders were hunched, his hands gripping his drink a little too tightly. He looked like he wanted to disappear. The loudest of the group, a tall, confident young man named Kyle, leaned back in his chair with a smug grin. "I don't get what the big deal is with veterans anyway," he said loudly. "They act like they're heroes just for doing their job. Give me a break." James's jaw tightened. He wasn't one to react impulsively, but hearing someone so casually dismiss the sacrifices made by countless men and women struck a nerve. He reminded himself to stay calm, taking a deep breath and letting it out slowly. The group's behavior escalated as they began clapping mockingly when Lisa accidentally dropped a glass. She knelt to pick up the pieces, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. But Kyle didn't let it go. "Careful, Lisa. Don't hurt yourself. We'd hate to lose such a skilled bartender," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. James's patience was wearing thin. He glanced around the bar, noticing how quiet everyone else had become. The tension was palpable, as if the entire room was waiting for someone to step in and put a stop to the group's behavior. James met Lisa's eyes as she stood up, brushing off the teasing with a forced smile. She gave him a small, apologetic shrug, as if to say there wasn't much she could do. But James disagreed. There was something he could do. He adjusted his seat, preparing to intervene if things got worse. The group's laughter filled the air again. But James no longer heard it as noise. Instead, it was a signal, a call to action. His time in the military had taught him to recognize when a situation needed leadership, and right now, this bar needed someone to take charge. James waited, his eyes steady and focused on the group. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he was ready to stand up for what was right. The rowdy laughter continued, but for James, the moment of truth was fast approaching. The laughter from the corner of the bar grew louder, and the group's taunts turned sharper. James sat quietly, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of his glass. He could feel the unease growing in the room, like a low hum in the air. The older man with the military cap, who had been trying to keep to himself, became their next target. "Hey, old man," Kyle called out, leaning forward with a smirk. "Did you fight in a war or just get that hat at a thrift store?" The other men burst into laughter, some clapping their hands on the table. The elderly man froze, his shoulders stiffening. He didn't respond, keeping his head down as if hoping they'd lose interest. But Kyle wasn't done. "Come on, Grandpa, tell us a story. What was it like fighting with sticks and stones?" The man's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his glass tighter, his face a mix of embarrassment and quiet anger. Lisa, the bartender, glanced at James, her expression pleading, as if silently asking him to do something. James's patience had reached its limit. He'd been watching the group closely, weighing his options. He knew from experience that reacting in anger wouldn't solve anything, but ignoring the situation wasn't an option either. Respect was something James valued deeply. Respect for others, for oneself, and for the sacrifices people made in life. And tonight, that respect was being trampled on. Kyle leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was causing. "Guess he's got nothing to say," he said with a mocking shrug. "Maybe he's forgotten how to speak." The other men laughed again, and the sound grated on James's nerves. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. The room seemed to hold its breath as he walked toward the group. His presence was commanding, not because he was loud or aggressive, but because of the quiet strength he carried. James stopped a few feet from their table and looked directly at Kyle. His voice was steady, not raised, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's enough." Kyle raised an eyebrow, surprised but not intimidated. "And who are you, old man?" "The fun police." James ignored the jab and continued, his tone even. "That man over there," he said, nodding toward the elderly veteran, "earned the right to wear that hat. Whether you respect it or not, you don't get to mock him for it." The laughter from the group faded, replaced by awkward silence. Kyle smirked, trying to regain control of the moment. "Oh, so we've got another hero in the room. What are you gonna do? Lecture us?" James stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I don't need to lecture you, but I will remind you that respect is a choice. You can choose to make this place better or worse for everyone here. Right now, you're making it worse." Kyle's friends exchanged uneasy glances. The mood in the bar had shifted. It was no longer just a game of taunts and jokes. James's calm authority had a weight to it that couldn't be ignored. Kyle opened his mouth to respond, but James cut him off. "Think about the kind of person you want to be. Because right now, you're showing everyone here exactly who you are." The room was silent, every eye on the scene. Kyle's smirk faltered as the impact of James's words sank in. The young men didn't laugh this time. Instead, they sat quietly, unsure of how to respond. James took a step back, giving them space to make their next move. He wasn't here to fight them. He was here to stand up for what was right. The choice was theirs now. The bar remained silent as James stood in front of the group, his calm demeanor carrying an undeniable sense of authority. Kyle, the ringleader, shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable under James's steady gaze. His earlier confidence seemed to falter, but he wasn't ready to back down yet. Kyle forced a smirk, leaning forward with his arms resting on the table. "Look, man, we're just having a little fun. No harm done. Why don't you go back to your drink and let us enjoy ourselves?" James's expression didn't change. "There's a difference between having fun and tearing others down to make yourself feel bigger," he replied evenly. "You've crossed that line." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Kyle's friends looked less sure of themselves now, their bravado fading. They weren't used to being called out, especially not by someone who spoke with such calm conviction. Kyle, however, wasn't ready to let it go. He stood up, trying to match James's presence. "And what if I don't feel like taking advice from some guy who thinks he's better than us?" James didn't flinch. He had faced far more intimidating situations during his years in the military. This wasn't about ego or proving himself. It was about standing up for the values he believed in. He met Kyle's challenge with quiet strength. "I'm not better than anyone," James said, "but I know what respect looks like, and this isn't it. You can choose to keep this up, or you can show the kind of person you really are." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Kyle's friends fidgeted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. One of them, a younger man with a nervous look, spoke up. "Maybe we should just chill, Kyle. It's not a big deal." Kyle shot him a glare but didn't respond. He looked back at James, searching for something to say that would let him save face. But James's calm, unwavering presence made it clear that this wasn't a fight he could win with words. The older man in the military cap, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke. His voice was quiet but steady. "Thank you," he said, looking at James with genuine gratitude. "It means more than you know." That simple statement seemed to shift the energy in the room. The other patrons, who had been watching the scene unfold with bated breath, began to relax. Some nodded in agreement, their expressions supportive. Kyle's smirk disappeared, replaced by a look of uncertainty. He glanced at his friends, then back at James. For a moment, it seemed like he might escalate the situation, but something in James's calm demeanor stopped him. Kyle exhaled sharply and sat back down. "Fine. Whatever. Let's just drop it," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. James nodded, his job done. He stepped back and returned to his seat at the bar, allowing the tension in the room to ease. The quiet murmur of conversation slowly returned as the other patrons began to relax. Lisa placed another drink in front of James, her expression one of quiet appreciation. "That took guts," she said softly. James shrugged, his voice low. "Sometimes you just have to stand up, even when it's uncomfortable." As he sipped his drink, James noticed the group at the corner table sitting quietly, their earlier bravado replaced with a subdued energy. The confrontation was over, but the lesson lingered in the air, leaving everyone in the room with something to think about. The bar had finally returned to a more comfortable atmosphere, but the tension from moments ago still hung in the air. James sipped his drink slowly, his gaze drifting over the room. The group of young men in the corner had fallen silent, their earlier laughter replaced by an awkward stillness. It was clear that the confrontation had affected them, but how much it would change them remained uncertain. James was not one to seek attention, and he didn't want to linger on the moment longer than necessary. He preferred peace and quiet, and he was sure the other patrons felt the same. But something unexpected happened when the older man with the military cap stood up and walked over to him. "Hey," the man said, his voice deep but kind. He extended his hand to James. "I just wanted to say thank you." James looked up, surprised. "You're welcome," he replied, taking the man's hand with a firm shake. "I couldn't just sit by." The man smiled, a look of respect in his eyes. "I've seen a lot in my time," he said, "but it's rare to see someone stand up like that these days. Most people just ignore what's going on around them." James gave a small nod. Sometimes people need to be reminded of what's important. The man chuckled softly. "I couldn't agree more. My name's Harry, by the way. I was in the Navy back in the day." "James," he replied. "I served in the Marines." The two men shared a brief moment of mutual understanding. They didn't need to say much more. Both had experienced the bonds of service, and both understood the value of respect in a world that sometimes lacked it. As they spoke, one of the young men from the group, the one who had been most silent during the confrontation, stood up and approached James. His body language was hesitant, almost nervous, as he shifted from foot to foot. James looked up, waiting to see what he would say. Excuse me," the young man said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I just wanted to, apologize for how we were acting earlier." James raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sincerity in the young man's tone. "I appreciate that," he said simply. The young man continued, looking genuinely remorseful. "It was wrong of us. We were just trying to impress each other, but that's no excuse for disrespecting anyone, especially not a veteran. You didn't deserve that. I'm really sorry." Harry, who had been watching the exchange, placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You've got more courage than most who admit when you were wrong," he said with a smile. "That's what matters." The young man nodded, visibly relieved by Harry's words. "Thanks. I think we all needed to hear what you said earlier. It made us think." James smiled faintly. "Sometimes it takes someone pointing out the obvious for us to see it," he said. The rest of the group, who had remained silent until now, seemed to come to a similar realization. One by one, they began to apologize as well, each of them acknowledging their behavior in a way James had not expected. It was a quiet, humble moment, and it didn't escape the attention of the other patrons in the bar. The atmosphere had shifted. The Rowdy group of young men who had once disrupted the peace were now genuinely reflecting on their actions. James didn't expect apologies, nor did he need them. But he could see that something had changed, and for that he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. As the group settled down, James returned to his drink, his job done. The night had taken an unexpected turn, but sometimes the most meaningful moments came from the most unexpected places. The bar had quieted down significantly after the group of young men apologized. The earlier tension seemed to dissolve, replaced by a sense of reflection and understanding. James sat at the counter, still nursing his drink, his eyes scanning the room. The group, now much quieter, had settled into their seats, their earlier confidence replaced by an awkward calm. Harry, the older man who had spoken with James earlier, returned to his seat, casting one last look at the young men. "You know," he said with a chuckle, "sometimes it's the people who least expect it that make the biggest difference." James smiled, nodding. "It's not about expecting anything," he replied. "It's just about doing what's right." The younger man who had first apologized to James looked up from his seat. He was no longer sitting with his usual cocky demeanor. His eyes were thoughtful, and there was a hint of respect in his expression that hadn't been there before. "Hey, I just wanted to say again," he said, this time addressing James directly. "We messed up. I don't know what we were thinking, but you were right." James glanced over at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "It's all right," he replied. "It's about learning. We all make mistakes." The young man nodded slowly, looking over at his friends. "Yeah, it's about learning," he said, repeating James's words. The others in the group, who had been avoiding eye contact earlier, now began to speak up as well. "I never really thought about it that way," another member of the group admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess we all kind of just got caught up in the moment." It's not an excuse, though. James could see that the group was genuinely processing what had happened. Their earlier arrogance had faded, and now there was something more vulnerable in the air. It was a shift that only a few minutes earlier would have seemed impossible. The young man who had first apologized turned back to James, this time with a more genuine smile. "You know, you could have just let it slide and let us keep making a fool of ourselves," he said. "But you didn't, and I think we needed that." James shrugged, his expression humble. "Sometimes it's not about letting people be who they are. It's about helping them become better." The group was quiet for a moment, reflecting on his words. James wasn't expecting any grand gestures or promises. He had already said what needed to be said, and it was clear that the message had hit home. They didn't need to change in an instant, but the seeds of respect and self-awareness had been planted. Harry, watching the exchange, smiled approvingly. "You're making more of an impact than you think, my friend," he said. "These young guys will remember this night." James didn't respond immediately, instead choosing to enjoy the quiet that had fallen over the bar. It was rare to find peace in moments like these, but it was clear that something good had come out of a situation that had once seemed hopeless. As the group of young men sat in thoughtful silence, the bar returned to its usual rhythm. The laughter from earlier had been replaced by quieter, more genuine conversations. It was a shift that no one had expected, but one that everyone appreciated. James leaned back in his seat, feeling a sense of satisfaction. He wasn't looking for applause or praise. The real victory was in the change he had seen in the group. That was all the reward he needed. As the night wore on, the once rowdy group in the corner of the bar began to settle into a more thoughtful silence. Their earlier laughter had been replaced with soft conversation, and the tension in the room had all but disappeared. James sat back, his eyes scanning the bar and watching as the younger men exchanged quiet words. It was as if the earlier chaos had opened a door for them, a chance to reflect on what they had said and done. The older man, Harry, had returned to his seat, and James could see that he was pleased with how things had turned out. Harry had a calm demeanor, one that didn't need words to express how he felt. He took a slow sip from his glass, nodding approvingly at James. "You did more than just stop a fight tonight," he said quietly. "You changed the way those young men will think, maybe even for a long time." James gave a small smile, though he didn't say anything in return. He wasn't here to seek recognition or praise. His satisfaction came from the subtle change he had witnessed in the group. It was a quiet victory, but it meant more than any applause or thanks could provide. As the night passed, the young men seemed to take on a new air of humility. They didn't act the same as they had when they first walked in, loud, boisterous, and filled with arrogance. Now they sat in low conversations, their voices more respectful, their earlier mockery replaced by genuine dialogue. James couldn't help but notice that their behavior had transformed in front of his eyes. One of the young men, the one who had first apologized to James, looked over at the older man in the military cap. "Hey, sir," he called across the room. "I just want to say, you were right. I've got a lot to learn about respect. I didn't understand it before, but now I get it." The elderly man, Harry smiled softly, his eyes kind. "It's never too late to learn," he called back, his voice warm but firm. "The real challenge is making sure you remember the lesson." The young man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I will," he promised. James continued to watch, pleased by the shift. This wasn't just a quiet night at a bar anymore. It had turned into a turning point, a moment when the group of young men had the chance to reflect on their actions and change the way they saw the world around them. It wasn't about big gestures or dramatic speeches. It was about understanding the value of respect and how easily it could be lost, and how even easier it could be gained back. The bar began to return to its usual rhythm, the hum of conversation filling the space as patrons chatted and laughed in a more comfortable tone. There was no longer any sense of discomfort, no undercurrent of tension. The young men had done more than just apologize. They had changed their behavior, not just for the night, but perhaps for the long term. James finished his drink, standing up slowly and preparing to leave. Harry, catching his movement, gave him a nod. "You done for the night, friend?" he asked with a knowing smile. James smiled back, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." As he walked toward the door, he glanced back one last time at the young men. They were still deep in conversation, their voices low, respectful. James knew the night had made a difference, even if it wasn't something anyone would announce or celebrate. Some victories didn't need to be loud. They were simply moments that changed things, one small step at a time. And tonight, that's exactly what had happened. James stood outside the bar, feeling the cool evening air against his skin. The streets were quiet, and the sound of distant traffic hummed in the background. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath and looking up at the stars. Tonight had been unusual, but in a way that left him feeling peaceful. He didn't need to stay and watch the group of young men for the rest of the evening. What mattered was what had happened inside. The change, however small, had already been made. As he started walking toward his car, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw the young man who had first apologized to him earlier, walking toward him with a determined look on his face. "Hey, James," the young man called out. James stopped and turned to face him. "Hey," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" The young man, still a little nervous but with more confidence than before, stopped in front of him. "I just wanted to thank you again," he said, looking genuinely grateful. "Earlier, I was one of the guys making fun of people, not thinking about how it might affect anyone else. But when you spoke up, I realized I was wrong. And I don't want to forget that. I don't want to be that guy anymore." James smiled, his eyes softening. "I think you're already on the right path," he said quietly. "It's not about never making mistakes. It's about learning from them." The young man nodded, clearly moved. "Yeah, you're right. I'm going to make sure I do better. Not just for tonight, but going forward." James gave him a reassuring look. "It's all anyone can do. We all have to learn. The important part is recognizing when we need to change." For a moment, the young man didn't say anything. Then he gave James a slight, almost shy smile. "I'll remember this night, and I'll make sure my friends do too." James nodded, feeling a sense of quiet pride in the young man's words. "It's good to know you'll take something positive from it." The young man glanced back at his group, still sitting inside, before turning back to James. "They're not all bad. I think this is just the kind of thing we needed to wake us up a bit. So, thanks again." James didn't respond right away. He just gave a simple nod, acknowledging the young man's words. "No problem. Just keep thinking about it." With that, the young man turned and walked back into the bar. James watched him go, his expression thoughtful. He knew that the group's behavior had been changed, not just in that moment, but in a way that might last. People often took a while to truly reflect on their actions, but James believed that this group had started something important tonight. As he slid into his car, James glanced back at the bar one last time. He didn't need to stay and wait for more apologies or thanks. The change had already been made. It was a small moment in the grand scheme of things, but sometimes those small moments made all the difference. Driving home, James couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had seen the shift in the young men, witnessed the change in their attitudes. It wasn't just about what happened in the bar. It was about how each of them had started to think differently, to see the value in respect and kindness. James didn't expect to be celebrated, nor did he need any recognition. The truth was, he had simply done what felt right, and that was enough. As he pulled into his driveway, James knew that, in his own quiet way, he had made a difference, not just for that night, but for the future as well. And sometimes, that was all that mattered. The next morning, James woke up feeling surprisingly light. The events from the previous night played in his mind, but instead of frustration or anger, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. It wasn't often that he had the chance to witness real change in others, especially in a place like the bar. But last night had been different. He had seen something shift in those young men. A change, subtle but real. As he made his morning coffee, James thought about the young man who had approached him outside the bar. He'd seemed genuinely determined to make things right, not just with James, but with his friends as well. It wasn't something James had expected, but it was something he hoped would stick. Later that day, James received an unexpected call. It was from Lisa, the bartender he'd spoken to briefly the night before. Her voice was warm, but also full of surprise. "James, I just wanted to let you know something," she said, a smile in her voice. "The group that was causing trouble last night, they came back in today. But this time, they were completely different. They apologized to me, to some of the other regulars, even to the elderly man with the military cap. It's like a switch flipped." James paused for a moment, his mind racing. "Really?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. "Yeah," Lisa continued. "They're talking differently too. More respectful, like they actually get it now. I just thought you'd want to know." James smiled softly. It was exactly what he had hoped for, but hearing it confirmed still made him feel like he had done something meaningful. "That's good to hear," he said, feeling a quiet sense of pride. Sometimes all it takes is a moment of clarity. After hanging up with Lisa, James felt a wave of gratitude. It was clear that the actions of one person, his simple decision to step in and speak up, had sparked something in others. It wasn't a grand gesture, nor did he seek any recognition, but it had made a difference. As the day passed, James couldn't stop thinking about the group of young men. He had done what he believed was right in that moment, and in doing so, he had unknowingly created an opportunity for them to change. Change wasn't easy, and it didn't always happen overnight, but sometimes all it took was one person to show the way. Later that week, James found himself back at the bar, this time without any intentions of confrontation. He just wanted to enjoy a drink, to relax after a long day. As he walked in, he noticed the young men sitting together at a corner table. They were laughing, but this time, their laughter wasn't mocking or loud. It was genuine, light-hearted. As James walked past their table, one of them looked up and caught his eye. The young man from the night before smiled and waved. "Hey, James," he called out. James nodded, returning the smile. "How's it going?" he asked. The young man grinned. "Much better. We've been thinking a lot about what you said. And, we just wanted to thank you again. You made us realize how important respect really is." James nodded, his expression pleased but humble. "I'm glad you're thinking about it." As James made his way to the bar, he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of accomplishment. The group wasn't perfect. They were still young and learning, like everyone else, but they had taken the first step toward becoming better people. And sometimes, that was all it took to change the course of things. That night, the bar felt peaceful, filled with calm conversations and the sound of clinking glasses. James didn't need to be the center of attention. He had already made his impact, and that was enough.